What made you choose immigration law as your field of specialty?
There are approximately 185 different visas available to enter the U.S., whether it's temporary in nature or permanent.
Talk about some of the key differences between a green card and U.S. citizenship.
I had a client who was kidnapped.
I've spoken to so many different people in other countries that always had that interest. And how hard is it to get here?
It can be a little more difficult to enter the U.S. Only because they're now looking at, was there misrepresentation?
Can you recall some interviews that went horribly wrong?
You have to go through a ton of different things to really show USCIS that you are at the top of your field, and it's up to USCIS to determine whether they feel that you are in fact at the top of your field.
We are back for another episode. Welcome. Glad you guys are here with us today. We really appreciate your ongoing support too. Our subscriber numbers are going, our listens are going up, our views are going up, and it's all thanks to you who are subscribing, who are watching, who are listening, and following everything that we're doing. Really appreciate the support, and it's just great to be able to bring this content. And today we got a really interesting one. I know that I say that all the time, and we have some fantastic guests, and we're very fortunate on this podcast, but this one is about immigration to the U.S. A lot of people are interested in immigrating, moving to, living, working, starting a business in the U.S., and it's not a simple process. What are some considerations in applying for residency in the U.S.? How does one immigrate to the U.S.? Well, our guest today is an expert in this area. She's the principal attorney at Direct U.S. Immigration. It's a Washington, D.C. based immigration law firm. We're happy to have on the podcast Miatrai Brown. Miatrai, thanks for being here with us today.
Thanks for having me, Mike.
Yeah, looking forward to our conversation. This is a pretty interesting topic. There's a lot of components to immigrating to the United States, and I know a lot of our listeners abroad are probably going to be interested in hearing some of this. But I want to just start with you. What made you choose immigration law as your field of specialty?
Absolutely. So I was initially drawn to immigration law early on due to international experiences in sports and volunteer work, where it illuminated the critical importance of cross-cultural and cross-intellectual exchange. So traveling for sports and volunteering internationally really allowed me to witness firsthand the profound impact of cultural interactions and the exchange of ideas, deepening my appreciation for the role that these elements play in enriching communities, corporations, and just fostering general global understanding.
That's interesting. And did you just find in your time abroad that a lot of people wanted to live in the U.S.? It just seems like one of the more sought after countries where people desire to live. Am I right?
So my initial travels, it was more so just understanding how similar we were. Of course, we had different languages, different cultures, but I just saw the similarities between, myself and those abroad. As I grew older, I started to see, individuals really do want to travel to the U.S., whether it's, companies that need to hire specialized workers or investors that want to diversify their portfolio, students that want to study in the U.S., or just individuals who just want to, visit, the Statue of Liberty or anything, the White House or, anywhere else in the U.S.
Yeah, a lot of people, want to work here.
Mm-hmm.
I've spoken to so many different people in other countries that always had that interest. And how hard is it to get here?
So there are approximately 185 different visas available to enter the U.S., whether it's temporary in nature or permanent. So it really depends on what the person wants to enter, what their intention is in the U.S. And what their background is. So if it's not the right fit of a visa, it can be very hard. But if the individual is in line with what the visa regulations are, then it's definitely something that they can pursue.
Okay, and one that I was looking at just when I was reviewing notes before our conversation was the religious worker visa. That seems like an interesting category for people who are maybe in ministry. What does that entail?
Yeah, so anyone thinking, to come to the U.S. and, kind of a religious role, they can do so under the R1 visa. It's basically for people who are part of a religious group for at least 2 years, and they're coming to work for a nonprofit religious organization within the U.S. So, they can work as a minister in a, professional religious role, or even in a religious vocation like a nun or a monk. The visa typically allows you to enter into the U.S. for about 2.5 years, and then you can extend for a total of 5 years. But in order to actually be able to come into the U.S. to work in that role, an employer actually needs to sponsor you for it, where they will file Form I-129F with USCIS in order to sponsor that individual.
So I understand there's also a diversity lottery for green cards. Can you tell us more about that and who can participate?
Sure. So the diversity visa lottery was originally created for individuals who come from countries with historically low immigration rates into the U.S. It allows them a chance to apply for a green card. Typically, every year there are about 55,000 visas that are available, and winners are basically chosen at random. If selected, they can then apply for an actual green card application, where there's separate requirements for that. But to place themselves initially in the diversity visa lottery program, you typically have to meet very basic education or work experience levels, and it's free to enter. You just have to apply within the official registration period that the U.S. government website allots, which is typically in the fall.
Okay. And that's a yearly thing?
Yes.
Is there a lot of people? Like, is it very competitive, or does it depend on the country? How do the numbers work? What are people like? Are the odds in people's favor if they're trying to get in?
Absolutely not.
Really?
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow.
So there are certain countries that are designated each year. The countries change each year, but generally there are certain countries that generally stay on the list for the most part. In terms of likelihood of selection, it's very, very low. So it's better to have something kind of, figured out in the background, or kind of like an underlying, idea of how to enter the U.S. another way in case they're not selected in the diversity visa lottery.
Tell us about the EB-1 green card. Who can qualify for that?
Yeah. So the EB-1 green card is for individuals who are at the tip top of their field, who wish to live in the U.S. permanently. There are three main groups who qualify there, and those include individuals with extraordinary ability in the fields like sciences, arts, sports, outstanding professors and researchers, or executives or managers of international companies being transferred into the U.S. So you can generally prove your achievements through awards, publications, or, other big accomplishments. There's a list that you can kind of pick from, and anything else that you believe, shows that you're at the top of the field, to really demonstrate to USCIS that you are at the top of your field. But overall, it's just a great option if you're a highly accomplished professional.
And how rigorous are the credentials for that? Like, are they pretty strict with who they let in? Do they really vet those people?
Very strict. So I would say out of the three categories, the easiest, but not so easy way in would be the third category, which is through an executive or a manager. Because mostly, for the most part, you have to show that you were an executive or manager in, working in the foreign corporation, and then transferred to the U.S. either as an executive or a manager. Whereas extraordinary ability, which is that first category, you have to go through a ton of different things to really show USCIS that you are at the top of your field, and it's up to USCIS to determine whether they feel that you are in fact at the top of your field.
And do a lot of people get declined who apply for that?
Absolutely.
Really?
Yeah. So it's really important to first, talk to an immigration professional, preferably an attorney that routinely files these types of green cards, so that they can, really be upfront about whether you qualify or if you don't. And if you don't qualify, they can give you an idea of exactly what you need to do in order to put yourself in a better position to qualify for this type of green card.
Do the occupations change from year to year for that, or are they all just kind of a standard list?
It's pretty standard: sciences, arts, sports. But the the occupations, so long as they fit within one of those categories, it's okay.
Okay. And family sponsorship is a big one here. Is it only an option for U.S. citizens to sponsor somebody? Can permanent residents do it? How does the sponsorship thing work?
Sure. So both types of individuals can sponsor their family members. For U.S. citizens, they have a broader group that they can sponsor, so they can sponsor their spouse, children of any age or marital status, siblings, parents. However, green card holders can only sponsor their spouses and unmarried children under the age of 21. But the process just typically includes filing a petition with USCIS, just proving the familial relationship, and then depending on whether the family member is inside the U.S. or outside of the U.S. Depends on the forms that need to be filed subsequently.
Are those people allowed to work once they get approved?
Yes. So once their green card is approved, yes, they can work. Prior to the green card being approved, if they apply for an employment authorization document, more casually called an EAD, once that's approved, they can work. Or if they have an underlying status such as an H-1B, an L, or an O, they can work through that visa while their green card application is pending.
Okay. And so talk about the interview process for a green card. What can people expect?
Sure. So first and foremost, not all green card applicants actually have to undergo an interview process. It really depends on the category of the green card that's being applied for, as well as the location of the individual. If they're outside of the U.S., then yes, they will have to go through and undergo an interview. If they are inside of the U.S., for example, it's a family-based application, somebody's applying for their spouse or children, then if the application has sufficient information in it for the officer to make a decision without bringing the family or the foreign applicant spouse in, then it's up to the officer to determine whether they in fact want to bring the family in, and they can just approve the case without seeing the family members. But if an interview is required, it's typically the last step in the process, and really it's the officer making sure that the information in the application that was submitted is still accurate and up to date. However, sometimes there are cases where an officer may feel that something might be, a piece of information might be misrepresented, and in that case, they'll really kind of go in to see pretty much what's going on.
Green cards expire every 10 years and then they have to be renewed. What happens if a green card holder fails to renew their green card after it expires?
Sure. So we'll talk about green card holders who are inside of the U.S. and then green card holders who are not.
Yeah.
If they're inside of the U.S., there's no need to panic. Because a green card, the actual physical green card expires, does not mean that they're no longer in that status. And that's if they have the 10-year green card. If they have the 2-year green card, then it will be a problem. But for this, specific, question, I'll talk about the permanent 10-year one. So really, it's just, their ability to show proof that they qualify, that they in fact have green card status is just no longer there. So they will need to just file Form I-90 to renew or obtain basically new evidence that they are in fact in green card status or as a lawful permanent resident. If they have to work or travel outside of the U.S., generally speaking, so long as they have that the receipt notice for the filed, green card renewal, they can travel and re-enter. They can also, schedule an InfoPass appointment and get a stamp in their passport that shows that they are in fact a green card holder and they can travel. Now, the problem lies if they are outside of the U.S.
Okay.
So if they're outside of the U.S. and they've been outside of the U.S. for an extended period of time, so when I say extended, I mean over a year, over 2 years, over 5 years. If they so there's two ways to try and keep, that green card status. They can try to re-enter the U.S. on their expired green card, which, it really depends on the CBP officer at the border and whether they're actually going to allow that individual in. If the individual has circumstances that show that they did not intend to remain outside of the U.S. for that long, so for example, they had a family member that was very sick and they had to take care of them, then sure, that's understandable. I had a client who was kidnapped, and
Really?
Yeah, it was
Wow.
it was
That sounds
it
crazy.
was pretty bad.
Yeah.
He Part of it is kind of funny. When asking for evidence that he was in fact kidnapped, I was just like, do you have any proof, or do you have, what can you show? And he was like, no, they didn't give me a receipt saying that I was.
Good answer.
That's not what I meant. And so I was like, no, like, a screenshot of your bank statement or bank account,
Yeah.
and then, maybe calls that were made, and then another screenshot after, the call is showing that a substantial amount of funds were taken out. But yeah, it was a very,
Like the kidnappers robbed
yeah,
this
yeah.
individual?
So yeah,
Wow.
kidnapped the
Okay.
individual who owned a oil company. Um,
Hmm.
Kept the person, called the family. The family obviously, paid the ransom, and then they
Hmm.
luckily released the person without, too much physical or emotional damage. Although,
Hmm.
kind of a really tough situation to be in. But
Yeah.
that was a extraordinary circumstance. So they were actually able to get back into the U.S. But if
Hmm.
somebody is just outside of the U.S. and working for another, company that's outside of the U.S. and just living their life outside abroad and paying taxes abroad and not paying taxes in the U.S., then it's going to be harder to show that they did in fact want to keep their green card status, and and therefore can come back on the green card. So two options: either go
Hmm.
to the border, attempt to I guess politely argue your way in with C,
Yeah.
or just file for basically a green card at the U.S. Embassy or consulate closest to you through the SB1 visa.
So, how forgiving are those CBP officers if you try to show up on an expired green card? Obviously, it's case specific, but do they give a lot of grace? Do they revoke cards? How do you find that?
Sure. So it is very much at the discretion of how that officer feels at the time of speaking with the individual. So,
Hmm.
you know, hopefully they wake up on the right side of the bed. Hopefully,
Yeah.
hopefully, the green card holder is respectful and has all the information and proof with them. So there's a lot of different things that kind of go into what the decision will be. But generally speaking, that individual will go into secondary inspection, which is basically a room that green card holders or basically non-U.S. citizens will sit in. Um, Sometimes it's a really poor experience for the individual who's trying to enter because, sometimes the officers just aren't as nice and might be accusatory. But
Hmm.
so long as you have the information in hand, and you're readily providing all the answers to what they're asking, then they'll assess whether they'd like to allow you in or not. If they don't
Yeah.
intend to allow you into the U.S., they will allow you to sign a form that basically allows you to abandon your green card. It's Form I-407.
Hmm.
And unfortunately, once you sign that, maybe if you have a tourist visa, which you probably don't, they would allow you into the U.S. But if you don't, then you just have to either go back to the country that you came from, or go to Canada or Mexico, and then
Yeah.
find another way to enter. If you want another green card, then you have to go through the process anew.
Right. Now you said they could make you revoke with that
Mhm.
I-407. They'll still let you into the country sometimes just on a like a visitor visa. So how does that work? Do you have a specific amount of time till you have to leave, or how does that process work if they let you in?
Sure. So generally, 9 times out of 10, an individual who has a green card doesn't have a tourist visa. But for example, individuals who are from Canada, you don't actually have to apply for, that B1, B2 visitor visa per se and get that, visa stamp. They generally will just, look at your passport, stamp your passport and allow you in. Other countries, you will in fact have to go to a U.S. embassy to get the visa and then enter. So it's more so for Canadian citizens that are more easily, able to enter the U.S. as individuals from other countries.
Okay. And you mentioned something that sometimes in secondary it can get unpleasant
Mhm.
for people. And I've been very fortunate in my own travels. I've never really had issues with U.S. customs officers. They've been pretty nice to me,
Yeah.
thankfully, but I've heard horror stories from other people.
Yeah.
What do you think is the cause of that? Do you think it's just people trying to sneak in? Why can they be so standoffish to certain individuals?
Sure. So you kind of have to think of it from an officer standpoint. They speak with thousands upon thousands of individuals, you know, and quickly assess whether they should be able to enter the U.S. or not. A lot of individuals who try to attempt to enter the U.S. on a visitor visa sometimes come to the U.S. and overstay, or switch to, or just do things that are not in line with the visa regulations. Since since 9/11, immigration has become much more intense than prior to that, just because of just doing security background checks and making sure that people who are coming into the U.S. are, coming for, good reasons or not. So, for example, with a B visitor visa, especially if you're applying for it at a U.S. embassy or consulate abroad, they're going to have the expectation that the applicant intends to remain in the U.S. Permanently and not in line with the visa regulations, unless that individual basically explains to them that they don't intend to be in the U.S. permanently, and it is truly and that they are truly entering for temporary travel.
Okay, now I've always wanted to ask this question, so I'm glad I got an immigration lawyer sitting with me right now. What do they see on the screen when they're pulling you up? So like, we obviously never see that. I don't know if that's confidential. What are they able to look at when you give them your passport or whatever document you have? Maybe it's a U.S. passport, you're re-entering, or you're somebody from abroad, Mexico, Canada, whatever it is. What do they see?
Sure. So, disclosure, I've never worked as a CBP officer or a officer at a consulate, but I've been practicing immigration law for almost 10 years. I've listened to enough stories. I have friends who are on the other side. Granted, they're not allowed to actually, tell you any specifics, but you can get a gist. So what I can say at the embassy level, the consular level, definitely what they see is the application that you submitted, which is the DS-160, and all the information you submitted on there. So your name, your parents' names, any spouse you may have, your employment history, education history, a bunch of those yes/no questions of, do you have any military experience? Do you plan to practice, X in the U.S. So they'll quickly kind of go through that. Generally, before speaking with the applicant, they'll have about a couple minutes if that, to review the entire application. Because they go through so many applications, they know exactly where to hit. So, have you ever entered the U.S.? Do you have a criminal history? Do you have a U.S. citizen spouse? That's a serious red flag, and a lot of the times they won't allow a person a visitor visa if they have a U.S. citizen spouse.
Now, why would that be? Wouldn't that give you more reason to enter if you have a U.S. citizen spouse? I don't understand.
Sure. So they assume that if you enter on a single intent non-immigrant visa, which just basically means that you must only have the intent to enter the U.S. in a temporary nature, they believe that because your spouse is in the U.S., they assume that you will end up staying in the U.S. permanently. Because technically, when you enter the U.S. on a tourist visa, USCIS believes that if after 90 days of remaining in the U.S., you can change your mind and say, you know what, actually, I do want to remain in the U.S. permanently, and your U.S. citizen spouse can sponsor you for a family-based green card. So a U.S. citizen spouse, if you happen to tell them that you have a U.S. citizen fiance or a U.S. citizen, significant other, red flag immediately.
So what do you do when you're visiting them? I don't understand. How does that work? I mean,
obviously, you have to tell the truth. But, you just say, I'm going to travel, to visit friends, or, I'm going to be traveling to visit these landmarks. You don't want to, so first and foremost, you don't want to lie.
Right.
hands down.
Yeah.
But
Full disclaimer.
yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
But at the same time, you don't want to mislead or misrepresent, what you'll actually be doing. So if you are, in fact, visiting family members, then, you know, you can say, yeah, I'm visiting my family members, but, I'm working in my home country and I only am allotted 2 weeks before I'm required to return back to work where I have to be physically present in this country. That can kind of help the officer to determine, is this person really going to come in the U.S. On a temporary nature, or if they do in fact need to return back. It kind of goes into, strong ties, showing strong ties to their home country.
So if somebody is planning to marry a U.S. citizen, do they have to do all that pre-planning? Is that best done outside of the country?
It's best to not plan to evade the visa regulations. So
Yeah.
in that specific instance, if somebody is considering, marrying their partner, they can enter the U.S. on a visitor visa, get married at any time, day one, day two. But if they do file for a marriage for a family-based green card application, it needs to be consular processed and it needs to be done with a person outside of the U.S. Or if they enter the U.S. on a tourist visa, they just need to have the mindset that they are just going to be in the U.S. in a temporarily. But if after 90 days, they revisit the idea and they say, what, I actually want to stay here permanently, then that's completely fine. They just can't,
Okay.
come into the U.S. thinking, that, I'm going to stay here permanently. I'm going to wait
Right.
90 days, set my
Yeah.
alarm, and then, say, actually,
Yeah.
I changed my mind. Like it has to be, much more natural.
Yeah. So if, let's say, a Canadian person is planning to marry a U.S. citizen and they still reside in Canada and they've already started the process, say they've started that consular process, but they don't live in the U.S. yet, are they able to tell, is it easy to cross the border then?
So it can be a little tricky.
Really?
So it depends on the history of the Canadian citizen. So if the Canadian citizen frequently comes to the U.S. And stays for a couple weeks and then exits, and the I-130 is pending, which is that first stage for the green card application, then they could get some pushback, but it's probably not going to be too much pushback. But once that I-130 is approved, which is basically saying, proof of the familial relationship, that approval goes through NBC and then to the embassy that's closest to their residence in Canada. But once it's approved and once they have a profile set up at the consular level, it's going to be much harder to enter the U.S. And they could be, rejected at the border.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
I never would have thought that.
Yep.
That's crazy.
Yeah, it's tough.
Wow. And that's all just because of suspicion that you might be overstaying.
Absolutely. That you would
Wow.
do. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So we talked earlier about interviews, green card interviews, without obviously divulging, client confidentiality in your past with clients. Can you recall some interviews that went horribly wrong?
I had a client that they were in the U.S. on a visa that only allowed them to be in the U.S. temporarily, and they could not have the intention to stay in the U.S. permanently. She was studying in the U.S. She had a boyfriend, who was a U.S. citizen, and they wanted to get married, and they had gone to school together for years. So it was, a relationship that budded organically. It definitely wasn't anything that was, even closely, related to immigration fraud. She wanted to exit the U.S. and then re-enter on a tourist visa. And I told her, I was just like, you need to be careful with that because, you're studying on an F1 student visa and then you want to exit and then re-enter on a tourist visa. Because I can't honestly remember why she wanted to do that. I'm not sure if she wanted to take a semester off or something like that.
Weird request, right?
Yeah. So I was like, or, you guys are planning to get married anyways, do you have a date set in mind? Because, or you could just get married because, her boyfriend was a U.S. citizen or it. and then we can apply for your travel authorization, and then you can travel as you please, and we can also apply for your work authorization. So students, they have restricted work authorization, so they can only work in the field of their major, whereas
Right.
an employment-based authorization based on their green card application, it's unrestricted. You can
Hmm.
work for any employer, multiple employers, self-employed. It's just unrestricted.
Hmm.
But she wanted to exit, so I was just like, oh, this is not a good idea, But I was like,
Yeah.
what? I can't force you to, stay in the U.S. It's completely up to you. All I can do
Yeah.
is advise you. So she exits the U.S., tries to re-enter, gets stuck in secondary. She's answering the questions just fine. And then I believe they opened up her phone and saw that, she had a boyfriend. And so they call the boyfriend, and it just kind of turns into a mess from there.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, she wasn't allowed to enter the U.S. and pretty much, had to stay outside of the U.S.
Hmm.
Her ability to re-enter the U.S. is just when something like that happens, it can be a little more difficult to enter the U.S. Only because they're now looking at, was there misrepresentation? I had another client that truly, just wanted to enter the U.S. for tourist reasons, and had done so many years prior, would enter, then leave, enter and leave. His business was outside of the U.S. He ran his own business. He truly could not stay in the U.S. that long. But at the airport, he ran into his friend's parents, and they're much older. And in that culture, you always very much help, the older individuals. And then also it's your friend's parents, so obviously, you're going to help. The airline person mistagged the bags. And so he wasn't sure, and he realized that they were mistagged once he got to the US. So he was just like, well, do I take my bags or do I take the bags that say that they're mine? So he took the bags that said were his, even though they were not his. He he was, called over for his bags to be checked, and he gave full disclosure. Hey, my bags were mistagged. They're actually my friend's parents. I'm not exactly sure why they're here, but they're waiting, outside, and they have my bags. Yada yada. In the suitcase were documents that show that, the parents either, it was like birth certificates and stuff like that. So basically,
Hmm.
documentation that show that if they didn't have an immigrant visa or a green card, then they were going to apply for one, or some other type of visa.
Yeah.
But it was their name and not his. So the officers just gave him such a hard time. And, he was very forthcoming, gave all the
Yeah.
information, allowed them to see, go into his phone. And they were still just very, very tough on him. And overall, they were just like, you know what, you can't stay. You will have.
Really?
Mhm. And
Wow.
so, yeah, so when that happens, especially if there's a finding of fraud or misrepresentation, um, it's really hard to get another, visitor visa if one
Hmm.
will even be issued. And it's just a very long process of applying for another one, providing additional information about what happened, filing a complaint about what occurred, having that sent up through, through into the embassy, through the Department of State, through all the
Hmm.
different entities, who, each officer, who knows what their caseload is, so who knows how busy they are.
Yeah.
So it's a mess. So,
Wow.
yeah, those are two cases that kind of stick in my mind, or stick in my mind as um, very much outliers of,
Yeah. Not what you as an attorney want to hear, right?
no, not at all.
Yeah. Is there an easy process? Well, it doesn't sound easy based on what you said, but how hard is clemency? Like, can you appeal, or what's the word? Can you exonerate yourself in those situations if that happens?
Yeah, so if you're inside the US and you're applying for a certain visa and, say it's denied, for a lot of visas, you can appeal the denial. Generally speaking, you can do a motion to reopen or a motion to reconsider. And generally speaking, you want to show new evidence that you didn't have at the time of filing the application that should have been readily available at the time. Or you want to show that the officer made an error in the legal interpretation of the law. So you can do that, especially when you're in the U.S. It's just a formality. Sometimes, a lot of the time they'll just kind of say, you know what, we're going to affirm, the prior decision, just refile. So depending on the case, sometimes it's better to just refile because, do you really want to file another application, pay another legal fee, another government fee to potentially have them say, you know what, we're just going to stick with what they said previously, or you just want to file a case anew and, and just pay those legal fees and government fees. But you also have to take into consideration, if an appeal is not filed, are you going to have any time that you're out of status and accruing unlawful presence? So there's kind of a lot that you're going to have to think about to determine what's best, whether you do unfortunately have to refile, so long as you have, a viable claim as to why you're refiling, or I'm sorry, whether you need to appeal, or, so long as you have a viable reason to appeal, or if you should just stop it there and refile anew. Now, if you are outside of the U.S. and you're applying at the embassy level, a lot of the times they don't allow you to kind of go back and forth with them about, no, I qualify. No, you don't. Yes, I do.
Yeah.
So you just file a new case, and they'll see the previous denial. They'll look at the notes that the officer may or may not have written to see why it could have been denied in the past, and then they'll make a decision based on the new application.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you. So you said if you just refile anew, they still see what happened before. Is that still a strike against that person?
Not necessarily. If you apply for a B visitor visa, once you get your first denial, it's much harder to get another one unless you wait a lot of time. If you applied for like a student visa and then you are instead going to, a company is sponsoring you for like an H-1B or an L or an O, then the embassy is not going to care about a denied student visa or a denied visitor visa at all unless you lied on the application or something like that.
How much without getting specific, how much do politics play into your job? Obviously, with different administrations coming in on the federal level, they have different views on immigration. Does that make your job difficult in some instances? Do you have to pivot the way you're doing things when things change on that level?
Kind of taking a step back before we even kind of get into what happens, when different types of administrations are in. Immigration is just a very complex subject. The regulations are always changing. The forms are always being updated. Fees are, changing. There's just a lot of moving parts. Now, when we add, different administrations on top of that, yeah, there are some administrations that are just more open to immigration, while others are more constricted, or others that, kind of want to change certain things. So, for example, for an H-1B visa, the standard is here, but they want only the, individuals who are very, who have top accolades, as a professional coming in versus the baseline. So, yeah. Different administrations definitely do play a role in how immigration is reviewed at the USCIS level as well as the consular level.
So it gives you a lot of homework every 4 years, right?
Yes.
Well, you're a lawyer. You're used to reading, I'm sure. Yeah. That's what you guys got to just read nonstop.
Yes.
And hats off to you.
Thank you.
I wish I could keep up. Talk about some of the key differences between a green card and U.S. citizenship. Obviously, green cards are permanent, as is citizenship, but they're not the same, right?
Correct. So a green card, the official name for it is a lawful permanent resident. And honestly, the cards aren't even green anymore. The cards used to be green, so they call them green cards. They're not. Green card holders, they have to keep renewing their status every so often. or renewing evidence of their status every so often. Technically, their status could be taken away. They can't vote. There are just certain things that they can't do. Even, previously when we spoke about who can you sponsor, what family members, there's less you can do as a green card holder. As a U.S. citizen, you can vote. You do have those rights. You can get a U.S. passport, so you have the benefit of that. And you never have to worry about, renewing your status as a U.S. citizen. And then, of course, you can just sponsor more family members as a U.S. citizen.
So why is hiring the right lawyer so important? Obviously, immigration is very complex, as you've shared with us already. Mm-hmm. What happens if someone tries to apply to the U.S. to live in the U.S. or work in the U.S. without a lawyer? Obviously, not good, right?
I could go into stories, but I won't. But
yeah. No, I want to hear
them. So let me just answer that first question, then I'll go into my crazy stories. So hiring an attorney that practices immigration law is extremely important because, like I said, immigration laws are complex. They're constantly changing. One small mistake can cause a delay or even a denial of your application or petition. So a good lawyer will really review your background to determine the most, efficient and hopefully cost-effective way to obtain your immigration goal. They know how to avoid certain, common errors, handle tricky situations, and will just guide you, handhold you through, every step of the process. Now, if you try to file a case on your own,
which you're well within your right, you can do that, right?
Absolutely. You do not have to hire an attorney for any immigration file that you want to file. But generally recommend it because we file these cases, we file hundreds upon hundreds of thousands of these cases. So we know, what USCIS is looking for. Or the Department of State or, whatever. On the U.S., but we'll talk about the USCIS level. So on the USCIS level, they have a website, gives you the forms, tells you the form edition, gives you instructions exactly how to fill it out, tells you, what documents you should provide. So you can absolutely do it yourself. But in filing these cases so routinely, yes, that's extremely helpful, but there are certain nuances that you also need to include. So for example, let's just take a marriage-based green card application. So proof that you're married to your spouse. A normal person would say, okay, marriage certificate, that's it, send it off, we're great.
Yeah.
No, that will get you a request for evidence and you will be stressed out, wondering, what else do I need to show proof of relationship other than this government contractual, agreement. But they want to see, photos. They want to see maybe screenshots of like a call log, or, pictures of you with, in a group with family, with friends, not a picture, 10 pictures in the same outfit, spouse looking unhappy, and also like you don't have to paint, the perfect picture of a relationship. Not every, a lot of relationships are perfect. You just kind of build, you figure it out. And so they don't want to see, oh, so happy, it's that, if you've never had a fight in your relationship before, and also you don't need to send screenshots of you arguing with your well, let me be clear with that. But
that'll probably ask more questions from the officer.
Exactly. But they understand, relationships, they want to see a real relationship. So you kind of have to be careful about, cultural norms of, your culture and your relationship and just how you are in your relationship versus U.S. norms. So, for example, a long time ago, I had a client that they just didn't wear their wedding bands, and it wasn't because they weren't a real, true, marriage and relationship. I knew they were. Like, I saw photos from, 10 years back. They just didn't wear it. And so I told them, I was like, I know you generally don't wear wedding bands at all, but please wear them for
Yeah.
your interview because
Hmm.
that is kind of a norm in the US. And so long as you're not opposed to it and so long as you don't feel some type of alienation, like you're forced to be something else, then
Right.
definitely wear the wedding band.
Yeah.
If you just don't want to do it, then it's fine. And if it comes up in the interview, then you can just explain exactly how you feel. So, sorry, kind of went off
Yeah.
tangent.
No, that's fine.
But yeah, so if somebody files their own case, they'll look at that list and they may send things that where the officer might want more things to review and see to make sure that that they're eligible for the whatever visa they're applying for. Now, you've got different types of individuals who are filing independently or pro se. So
Hmm.
you've got individuals who have never filed an immigration application. They read
Hmm.
it, they're like, yeah, it makes sense. They file it, everything is perfect. You've got that same person, like, read it, makes sense. They're like, this is very easy. They file it and they have issues. And then you've got the person who is like, I read it, I don't know, hope this works, sends it off.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the second two, where issues come back, you really have to be careful about how the forms are filled out. I had a client that an employer sponsored the prospective worker for an employment-based green card, and the applicant didn't tell the employer that their entire work history. They thought they only needed to tell the work history specific to that job that aligns with, that shows that they're qualified for it. But the application, because he was or no, he was inside the U.S. The application wants everything. So it was denied because the officer who was reviewing it was saying, I saw that a long time ago you filed a visitor visa application at the embassy, and in a specific period, you put that you worked here, but in this new application in that same period, you didn't put that job.
Hmm.
It wasn't related to his job, so the case got denied. And so,
And that's something you would have caught instantly, right?
yeah, so
Yeah.
basically, attorneys typically ask, what is your U.S. immigration history?
Hmm.
Let me see the application that was previously filed. If they don't have a copy of it, you can just file a FOIA request and get what they have. And then we review it to make sure that there aren't discrepancies between the case that we're filing and information that you filed previously. So with that, missing, that employment or whatever it was that was missed, there was a concern was, does USCIS think that you misrepresented yourself, that there was fraud? When truly, the employee just didn't realize that he needed to include it.
Yeah.
Years later, falls in love with a woman. They get married, and the woman's like, "All right, let's hopefully sponsor you for a marriage-based green card, and hopefully this goes through." So I looked at everything, and I was just like, you know what? There could be an issue,
Hmm.
with this issue that happened, some time ago, that could pop up again. In the form, we will include that we have to, because it asks, we will include that you had a previous denial, the reason for that denial, exactly what happened, and then USCIS will decide on their own whether they feel that you misrepresented yourself or engaged in fraud or whatever. And if they start to feel that way, it's going to be an issue, but we'll handle it. We'll, put you in the best position to try to overcome this. My fingers were like this. Luckily, USCIS didn't have issue with it. Normally when you're very forthcoming with, what's happened in the past, how you feel the events occurred, and then also factually, the case was filed on X date. This is the receipt number, as much information as you can provide. They feel that you're being forthcoming. Whereas if you don't provide it and they have to find out, then that's going to be an issue. So it's always better to be forthcoming than to hide something when filing an application. So do I recommend an attorney? Absolutely. Do you need an attorney? I kind of want to say yes, but technically no. You are not required to have an attorney to assist you with filing. But yeah, if you file something and you have to refile, or USCIS feels that there has been fraud or misrepresentation, just the fees start going up. And you file it, and then you have an attorney assist you later on, then the attorney is going to charge you extra, not their base price, they'll charge you extra to see what you filed, to then fix the issue. And it takes more time versus if the law firm or the attorney just prepared it on their own, and filed the case. So it may seem, expensive upfront to hire an attorney or a law firm, but in the long run, it's well worth it.
Yeah, it's not a Wendy's application. Like it's a serious government form, and you got to know what you're doing, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, and people overlook that.
Yeah.
Do you have any other horror stories?
Let me think. I'm sure I do.
It's okay if you don't, but they're fun to hear.
Yeah, well, I mean, sometimes I talk to, individuals and, in consultations, and they're just like, sometimes they're shy to tell their story about, this is what's going on with my family. And I'm like, listen, I've heard it all. There's nothing you can tell me that will make me, otherwise. So, my only thoughts are, what can we do to get you to your immigration goal? But yeah, immigration is interesting. It's always changing. You meet so many different types of people. Like I said, there's so many different types of immigration. Sometimes, a lot of people, and especially what's in the news, when you hear immigration, you automatically think, oh, illegals entering the U.S.,
right?
Mass deportation, but really, it's your large banking institutions, it's your large tech companies, it's your large corporations that need to hire foreign workers because they're specialized in something in particular that they can't find in the U.S. Or STEM professionals, where the U.S. just is not producing enough STEM professionals, and they need to get them from outside of the U.S. to bring them in the U.S. Or you've got investors who invest, 1.8 million or 900,000 to revitalize, certain parts of the United States that are just severely depressed. And for one, it helps the investor diversify their portfolio, but also allows them to enter the U.S. and, work to build parts of the U.S. it's great to build. And whether they are on a visa that requires them to be in the U.S., just temporarily, or if they're looking for a green card, like in a more permanent nature, then, there's that option as well. Or, there's the student who wants to come to the U.S. to learn and maybe work in the U.S. and then return back to their home country to, build up, their community. Or and then you've just got your traveler. There are tons of Americans that travel all over the world, and tons of individuals who want to, travel to the U.S. to, like I said, see the White House, or, or see Miami, or, whatever. So there's just so many different types of immigration, aside from, the humanitarian immigration that's more frequently in the news, like applying for asylum because they're fleeing something in their home country, fleeing persecution in their home country, or, illegally entering and being caught at the border, on a boat with just a ton of people trying to enter. So sometimes, so like I said, sometimes, immigration is just so, the news just shows one little piece of it, but that's just one little piece compared to all the other different types of immigration. Because even, being on yachts or cruises, the individuals who are working those ships, they're not always U.S. citizens. They need visas as well. So, yeah, it's an interesting topic, and you just meet so many different types of people.
Yeah, I can only imagine. How rewarding is it when you get that approval for that visa or that green card? That must really feel good for you. I mean, that really changes somebody's life, right?
Absolutely. And, even at the consultation stage, when, you're just chatting with a person to understand, what their background is, what their potential eligibility is, kind of telling them, hey, you're a great fit, or you're not a great fit, but we can try our best this way, but, there could be other avenues. Do you feel comfortable trying it this way? And, oh, actually, oh my gosh, I I had a very interesting client. I was applying for a national interest waiver for him. The national interest waiver green card is exactly what it sounds like. A green card for individuals who are working within the national interest of the U.S. When
Okay.
you think national interest, you probably think national security,
Yeah.
healthcare, education.
Yeah, he's not opening a juice bar,
So
right? Or was
he
he?
was not opening a juice bar. He was.
Nothing against juice
No.
bars.
I
No.
love juice.
Yeah, me too.
Bars, natural, yeah. So he was a middle school PE teacher,
Okay.
and I thought to myself, oh my, like, I've chatted with so many different types of people, but this is my first time speaking with somebody who was a PE teacher for middle schoolers. And I was just thinking, we really have to find an angle for this. So I was just like, okay. So I spoke with him, I understood his background, and I was just like, all right. So first and foremost, this is going to be an uphill battle, but we can talk about the angle of healthcare, how there is an issue of obesity in the United States, and where you need to work with the children to get them to understand the concept and, be healthy and this and that. And so we, wove in healthcare and, a couple other things. And of course, the case received a request for evidence because I'm sure the officer was just like, what?
Yeah. Same thing you said, right?
And we honed in on it more, and the case was approved. So,
Really?
yeah, because again, national interest waiver, you think maybe a scientist,
Yeah.
you think all of these things, you don't necessarily think a middle school PE teacher. So it's really,
I'm thinking like Department of Homeland Security, like they're going to assist in tracking individuals that shouldn't be here, or I don't know, whatever, right?
yeah. So,
Yeah.
but yeah, that was actually one of my most a very interesting case, because I was just like, this is not a good case. And I told him, I said, this is not a great case. And he was like, please. I've spoken to a lot of other immigration attorneys. Everyone said no. You at least said, it's an uphill battle, but you didn't specifically say no. And I was just like, okay. I was like, you know what? If you feel comfortable, we will try our absolute best, but just know that, this is not the type of case that we typically do. And when that case was approved, we were so excited.
Yeah.
He was so excited too. Like, his family was excited. It was, it was an emotional experience on both sides.
Yeah. That has to be an awesome feeling. And I mean, it sounds like the individual came from a place of goodwill too,
Yes. Yeah.
because we do have a health epidemic in this country. So I mean, that's fantastic that somebody can come in and try to make a difference on that level with young people, right?
Exactly.
Maitreya, I really enjoyed this conversation. How can people find you?
Sure. So people can, find us on social media, but they can go to our website. It's www.directusimmigration.com. Our social media handles are generally the @ and directusimmigration.com. I'm sorry, not .com. Direct U.S. Immigration. We're everywhere. We're on LinkedIn, TikTok, which my team was like, we need to be on TikTok. And I was like, well.
Are you dancing on there? Are you the dancing immigration lawyer?
I am not, but
All right.
it was actually our fastest growing social media platform.
Really?
So yes, it's interesting. It's so it's been amazing. But yeah, LinkedIn, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook. I always want to say Twitter, X.
Yeah. Only Elon says X. Don't feel bad.
Okay. And then of course, podcasts. So, Apple Podcasts and, wherever. But we're everywhere. But the easiest way to find us is through www.directusimmigration.com.
Okay, awesome. We'll put that in the show notes. And thanks for being here. This is a lot of fun.
Thank you so much for having me, Mike.
Absolutely. And that'll do it for this edition. We are out of here. Do you have an immigration horror story? We want to hear it. Drop it in the comments. Let us know. And always check us out at mikecpodcast.com. Until next time, thanks, everyone.
The Mike C. Podcast.